la seconda volta che onora il meeting della propria presenza. Era qui presente nel 2015 in occasione dell'edizione dedicata alla bellezza. L'altro giorno ci ha anche onorati della sua presenza per una conferenza dedicata al tema della coscienza, che è uno dei temi centrali nella sua ricerca che si è snodata per gran parte del XX secolo. I suoi contributi alla scienza sono talmente tanti che è impossibile sintetizzarli, siamo alla presenza di un gigante della scienza contemporanea. Voglio solo riferire due aspetti che possono darci un'idea della persona che abbiamo dinanzi. Ha insegnato per più di 30 anni al Collège de France a Parigi. Ne parlavamo l'altro giorno, che in questo istituto, che è uno dei più prestigiosi al mondo, vige una regola severissima per cui i professori non possono ripetere la lezione, o meglio, il ciclo di lezioni negli anni sugli stessi argomenti. Ogni anno devono inventare, tra virgolette, una tematica nuova. E questo ha contribuito alla grande creatività scientifica e non solo del professore CHANGEU. Un altro aspetto che mi piace sottolineare è che è il classico intellettuale illuminista, nel senso che ha interessi non solo nella scienza in senso stretto, ma anche nella filosofia e nell'etica. Ho avuto l'onore di scrivere insieme a lui un articolo sull'etica della dipendenza da droghe e fu un suo invito a fare questa ricerca insieme, proprio perché ha una grande sensibilità etica e chi ha letto i suoi libri, e tra l'altro mi diceva che la lingua in cui i suoi libri vengono tradotti più velocemente è l'italiano, quindi ha un grande pubblico di lettori in Italia. Chi ha letto, dicevo, i suoi libri avrà notato che c'è sempre una riflessione dedicata alle implicazioni sociali, etiche della ricerca scientifica. Uno dei campi, quindi, nei quali ha dato contributi straordinari e di fatto il fondatore di questo campo è quello delle neuroscienze dell'arte. Ed è proprio di questo che quest'oggi il professore CHANGEU ci parlerà. So, Jean-Pierre, thank you warmly to be here again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michele. Thank you for this invitation to discuss a very interesting issue, which is the neuroscience of art. And of course, the main idea is that we may try to find in our brain ways to perceive the work of art and also to conceive and create the work of art. So art is not only painting, but also music. And I want to illustrate by this beautiful painting by Piero della Francesca that, in fact, from the origin, there was no split between art and science, that the artists were scientists and the scientists were artists. And you can see in this beautiful painting something that you may have not noticed, which is this structure. And if you move to look at it, you realize that it's a beautiful mathematical construction. And nobody else than a good mathematician would have been able to paint this shell and this particular issue of an egg on the head of the Virgin. So this just to illustrate that from the beginning there was an alliance of science and art. And just here to illustrate the rational aspect of the music of Bach. A few definitions. Now, what is a work of art? I think it is an artifact. It means that it's a human production which is created for intersubjective communication using symbolic forms. So it's something that produce to communicate between each other. It's distinct from language. Music and painting is non-verbal communication of emotional states, imagination and rational experience, under the controls of rules of art. I will discuss this aspect later on. Now, there is something very unique in a piece of art, is the aesthetic efficacy. It's the staggering effect on sensory awareness, an explosive union of emotion and imagination or catharsis. And you all know about the Stendhal effect when he entered Santa Maria Novella in Florence. He fell. He was so emotionally invested that not always the case, but when you listen, when you see this Piero della Francesca, when you listen back, you have something in yourself which moves you very, if I may say, explosively. Now, music is a part of art, one art in addition to painting. And from Olivier Messiaen or Pierre Boulez, you get some definition which are consistent with what I gave about work of art in general. Now, what about science? I think science nowadays, not in the past, now, has a different aim. It is to produce knowledge, technology, to master nature, and this knowledge, as you may see from the technological development, is in constant progress. Now, the aim of art, to my opinion, today is different. I think the artist is a witness of his own time. You saw the Picasso painting in my first slide. And I may say that art conveys some kind of ethical message. And this was already mentioned by Poussin, the French painter, as an exemplum, something that you share between people and which is not exclusively knowledge. Second point, which makes the difference with science, is art is in constant evolution. Yes, but there is no progress. I cannot tell whether there is a progress between the Parthenon in Athens and the Vatican Church. I think both of them are outstanding. So I must say that there is no apparent progress in art, but nevertheless a constant renewal which adapts to the society and to the aim of the society. I will say a few words about contemplation, just to look at a piece of art. Here, for instance, this cave painting, which is one of the early testimony of art. I may say that 30 or 40,000 years ago, human beings, as we are, were already paintings, almost as we do now. And the physics of the painting is a distribution of line and colors with differential reflection of light, wavelength. And these wavelengths, which are reflected by the surface of the painting, is acting on receptors we have on our eyes. And there are some molecules called retinal or others. And these molecules, let's say, of rods and cones are in fact translated through allosteric transition, all the signals which come from the outside world. So the point I want to emphasize is that when we feel art, we have to realize that what comes from the piece of art is physics and molecular mechanism, and exclusively that. So there is a translation or transduction of the reflections on the surface of a piece of art into neural activity by the retina. And now, if you look at the shape of the painting, or the figures, or the forms, or the colors of the painting, you can realize that already in the visual cortex, you have some projection which is taking place. And you can see here clearly that this is the visual stimulus. It's not really a piece of art, I'm sorry for that, but it's a somewhat geometrical figure, but you recognize it on the visual cortex. So it means that there is clearly a projection of the image through these molecular events into our cerebral cortex, and in particular the visual cortex. And I may even say that there is some kind of preservation of shape, some isomorphism, which is not perfect, between the image and the projection on the cortex. Now, if you go further up in the brain, you can see that there are neurons which respond in the temporal cortex to particular shapes. Here they are T shapes or X shapes and so on. You see these particular shapes, and there are neurons which are specific for them. And this is, of course, of interest for us. And the painters have, of course, been using this ability of our brain to recognize shapes. I don't want to say that we have the full solution from a neurobiological point of view, but at least you can see that progressively from the projection, you have a specialization of the cerebral cortex which is taking place, and that there are, along the way, neurons which recognize form. And even some of them do recognize hands and faces. They are not the same. And even, you see, they recognize hand with 5 fingers. And they recognize face, for instance, here on the side, not frontally. So it means that we have highly specialized neurons in our brain that the artist here, Philippe de Champaigne, is actually using to convey the picture of Maddalena through the figure, the hand, and the way they are organized. Now, just to sum up, a lot of studies which have been done here, for instance, in the monkey brain. Here we are in the visual system, and we are progressing toward the temporal cortex and last, prefrontal cortex. So there is a pathway for recognition of objects, recognition of faces, I mentioned that, perception of colors, which is a ventral pathway, and a dorsal pathway for perception of movement, perception of depth, spatial organization, ground figure segregation. Now, progressively, 2 things are taking place. First, an analysis through the different areas of the image, form, face, color, and so on, and also a link with emotion, which is taking place throughout this progression. And here, you can see, for instance, that from the amygdala, which is on the way, you have some faces which create fear or love, and you see Magdalena inspiring love. And how does it happen? Through the mobilization of territories in our brain which are linked with the form of the image and the emotion we perceive. And progressively, we go up until the prefrontal cortex that you can see here. And this prefrontal cortex here is interesting because you have the analysis and the reconstitution of a global picture which is taking place in this prefrontal cortex, and mostly in what we call the global neural workspace for conscious processing. And you know, of course, some of you are awake, others are perhaps sleeping because of the heavy afternoon. I hope there are not too many. But of course, you can distinguish states of wakefulness, of sleep, and there are some structures in our brain which are involved in that. They are called ascending system, and one can account for the state of wakefulness or sleep or dream, and from reward. And this is, of course, something extremely important for the piece of art. And they have to be contrasted with other structures, which are those we are interested in now, because I suppose that somebody who is contemplating a painting is awake, is aware. And this is the so-called content of consciousness. There is in our brain a physical space where all these territories are meeting together, a global workspace, and where there is this resynthesis and perception, conscious perception of the image which is transmitted by the piece of art. And the idea we developed with Stanislas Dehaene and Michel Kersberg is that the way to link together these different areas in our cerebral cortex is through long-range connection. There is no need for any kind of magnetic thing or of mind or spirit or whatever. But physically, here we have a space where things become synthesized and perceived. And we call this the global neuronal workspace. And you may see the difference here. In the former slide, I showed the perception, the reception, and here, the conscious contemplation. So you have here the posterior areas of the visual cortex activated, no more. So this is non-conscious. And here you see the reverberation in the prefrontal areas, which give, according to our views, of course, is still a model, conscious perception. And furthermore, we postulate that there is some kind of activity in this global workspace, which is particular to conscious processing. And what was both measured and postulated is that there is some kind of wave. Here you see the progression from primary visual cortex, V2, V3, V4, and then the access to the prefrontal cortex with this wave, which ignite, whatever it is, our global workspace. So we have here a distinction between what Descartes called the res cognitans here, and the res extensa, which is a non-conscious one. I'm sorry, it's an interpretation of Descartes, but that's the way we may look at it. And this has to be taken into consideration for understanding the piece of art, since what I suggest is that there is a particular case of ignition when it is a piece of art. What do I mean? I mean that there is a wider mobilization of territories when there is a piece of art, they are linked together, and compared to, let's say, the ignition of a simple image as the one I showed before. And there is some evidence for that when you ask a child to respond to a face of a child here and compare it to the response of a face which is not so cute because it's a cleft palate child. And you can find a difference between the two. So I may claim, but this is the beginning, of course, it has been further investigated, that some kind of aesthetic ignition which is taking place and mobilize multiple brain partners. So this is, for me, some kind of neuronal basis of conscious processing, but as you know, there is also this emotional contribution, and this can be illustrated by the work of Zatorre in Canada, where he was able to record in the cingulate and orbitofrontal cortex, in the ventromedial and in the amygdala, the activity of these territories involved in emotions. And there are positive correlation for some of them and negative correlation. So there is a pleasurable response, which in addition to the shape or color or picture response, play a role here, in particular in music, but also in painting. And so this is what I should say about contemplation. Of course, it is all that is very preliminary. It has to be further documented. Now, what about creation? Creation, I may be inspired by both Leonardo and Darwin. I think it's a very distinguished people to be inspired by, if I may say. And the idea I wish to propose is we may have some kind of Darwinian mechanism for creation by variation selection. And we propose that there is a generator of diversity, which Gombrich calls schema and correction, where there is a combinatorial assembly of pre-representation for the artist's brain. Then there is a mechanism of selection when the artist finds that the combination is okay or not. And there is, let's say, a choice of fundamental idea, struggle for life of mental image, as the French philosopher Taine mentioned. And last, a mechanism of amplification from sketch to the artwork to multiple contemplation. So this can be implemented as a model and also have some, of course, physical basis. And here is a model that I propose with Stanislas Dehaene on a cognitive task which involves sorting, selection. And here you have some representation. There another one. And then one which is being selected because this representation has created reward on the subject. And of course, allosteric receptors would be involved there. So I propose that there is a role of selection by reward in the creative process of the artist. Are there some evidence for that? Yes, indeed. This is a beautiful Leonardo, which is present in the Louvre in Paris. And it took 18 years for Leonardo to finish it up, and even may say that perhaps it was not completely finished. Now, during 18 years, what happened? There is, if I may say, and from the documents we have from him in different museums, a trial and error Darwinian process involved. Here, you may recognize a little bit of Saint Anne and the Virgin and the baby here. This is 1500. Now, the next one, you see that Virgin Anne, Jesus, and John. So there are two babies, not one. And they are turning left. Now, the next one, they are turning right. And there are two Annes, surprisingly. And only one baby, Jesus, and now the lamb came in. So you see there are illustrations of all these trial and error processes that Leonardo they have through the creation and execution of the painting. Now I will finish up with a few more slides, which are on what I call epigenetic rules. Now, if you imagine that there is a combinatorial process in our brain which is taking place, now the number of combinations in the brain from billions of neurons and even thousands of billions of synapses, I think you are lost. You cannot really select anything from this enormous amount of combination. And in fact, to fight against this combinatorial explosion, there is a way to limit the number of combinations, which I call a rule, and so that it has a top-down effect, and which is, if I may say, an acquired pattern of connection, scaffolding, which are in the prefrontal cortex, and which are used by the artist to select, coordinate, harmonize interaction, not only between individuals in the social group, but within the brain itself. So, what are these rules? One is novelty. According to Boulez, to invent the unanticipated. And you can see in the brain, there are images of surprise which have been found and activate the frontotemporal cingulate cortex. What is it? Well, the global workspace I just mentioned before. And you have another rule which is common with scientists and which has been proposed by Herbert Simon. The beauty of a scientific proposition lies in the fact that it explains much from little. And here you have a Matisse which clearly satisfies the rule. It is, if I may say, an economy of means, the minimal use of components to create the representation. And of course, there is another one that you know very well, which is the consensus partium, is the universal search for harmony, from Alberti, the architect, the Renaissance, 1435. And here you have an illustration of the trial and error Darwinian process I already illustrated with Leonardo, and you see that progressively there is a selection of pictures which result in this final picture. And this is also associated with ways to check the coherence of representation. And this can be done here, for instance, in this melody here that you can see. You can see that if you are familiar with the melody, there is a larger response, while when you are not familiar with the melody, there is an incongruent response, which is much smaller than the congruent one. So there are ways to select in our brain for consensus partium. And this is, of course, very well illustrated in the Well-Tempered Clavier by Jean-Sébastien Bach, where equal temperaments correspond to actually artistic consensus partium. Now I will finish with 2 or 3 more slides, which is about the aim of art. It's to represent not only oneself, but the other. So oneself as another, as Paul Ricoeur would say, which is the basis of social life and harmony in the social life. And it's an ethical message that you can see here illustrated by Jacques-Louis David. And now there is, in addition to what I just said, and I mentioned it at the beginning, which is the exemplum that was mentioned already by Poussin, where the artist, by his testimony, invites the spectator to share his conception of the world and to contest an intolerable reality that we are facing presently in the several parts of the world and in Eastern Europe in particular. So this is also illustrated by Matisse, who, in addition, said that there is not only the exemplum, but the order that we create by art and science in an unlabeled, meaningless world by offering socially shared, and they are, you know the last one, it is easy to share socially. Everybody understands. And I would just like to close with, again, Jean-Sébastien Bach to illustrate this exemplum. Thank you very much.
Thank you Jean-Pierre. Penso che ci ha illustrato come si possa fare una sorta di viaggio a tutto tondo sul tema dell'arte. Un neuroscienziato che ha toccato appunto l'arte pittorica, la musica, ha portato dati sperimentali, ha illustrato modelli sulla base di questi dati, quindi insomma ci ha dato molto da pensare. C'è spazio solo per un paio di domande che siano strict to the point, come si dice, cioè molto focalizzate, non purtroppo contro relazioni. Si prenota il professore Carafoli. E per favore un microfono. We need a microphone for the audience. Okay.
A very simple question, Jean-Pierre, since there is no time. Historical question. Who has invented music? When was it invented? Was it a late accessory phenomenon post-language, or was it really at the original language? I'm asking because, as you know, this is a controversial story. Steve Pinker, who's domineering, thinks it came much late, whereas the new discoveries, anthropological of flutes in the Black Forest, indicate that it was the Neanderthals who really invented music before the language.
I have not. I think this is a very interesting question. I asked myself about it several times. And the answer is we don't know, but I can give you two facts. First of all, about the origin of language. It seems to have taken place between, it seems, it's not certain, between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, you know? And this transition is again supposed to have taken place because of the examination of the skulls, but it's a poor technology and it's not certain. Now, it's clear that the technology and sense of symmetry, which is an artistic feeling, was created long before. It was created with the axes, you know, these stone axes, which are symmetrical. So it's an a priori aesthetic aspect of these technical objects. So even now, some people claim that these are not instruments to kill, but they are representation of the human figure in a very simple way. So my guess is that both, I would say, visual art and music developed very early on in parallel. There are, you know, in caves like Lascaux, there have been floats which have been identified in some Slovenian caves. And my last answer would be the baby, the newborn baby. And you can see that you know very well that the newborn baby both hear and even appreciate music to some extent and start to say something, you know, to have vocal cries or others which are taking place as early as the first or 2 days of life. So you can also see through the development that there is a constant progress in the acquisition of language and in the acquisition of music, understanding and listening.
Bene, c'è spazio eventualmente per un'altra domanda? Bene, allora ringraziamo ancora il professore CHANGEU.